if there's a war, and then their infrastructure is fair game. They can't. If the Americans attack Iranian infrastructure or military targets, that's war. And so these regimes won't last more than a few hours or a few days. And you would see chaos across the Persian Gulf region. And then there would be no more tankers. The tankers would all be at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Let's just look at the map, the Persian Gulf. Iran owns half of the Persian Gulf. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf, and the northern side. And it's not a very wide piece of water. It's thin and long. And look at where U.S. bases are in, like in Qatar, in the Emirates, in Bahrain, in Kuwait. If the United States attacks Iran, these tiny countries are all complicit. What does that mean for their future existence? That would create a global economic catastrophe that I think is historically unprecedented. And it's not something that the Americans can do about anything about. They can't do anything about it. So no more oil, no more gas. I'm sure in Iraq you will see the resistance preventing oil and gas getting to the West. Probably in the Republic of Azerbaijan, you would see similar moves of people outraged. War in this region would destroy the US economy. And then imagine people on the move from because the world economy will collapse. Imagine people on the move everywhere. And where will they probably go, even though the United States and Europe will collapse? They'll be going to the United States and Europe. The amount of people going now would be just a trickle compared to the what we'll see if the global economy collapses. So I don't think that the United States wants this. I don't think that the military wants this. Of course, Netanyahu would love this. Fanatical Zionist, ethno supremacist madmen want this, but I don't think at the moment the US military would allow such a thing to happen. Nothing is for certain, but Trump is definitely not a very, how should I put it, stable person. You cannot, he may wake up in the morning and then suddenly say something different from what he was saying the night before. But I think that the stakes are simply too high for now. Look at Yemen. The Americans want to Yemen, which is it's it's clear that Yemen's military capabilities are not are very small compared to Iran's military capabilities. The people of Yemen are heroic, they are brave, they are courageous, and they are the heroes alongside Hezbollah. They and Hezbollah sacrifice themselves for another people. That's unbelievable what they've done and what they're doing. But Iran's military capabilities are second to none in the region, and the region is very, very sensitive because of oil and gas, and because of the petrochemical plants, and because of the refineries, and because of all the ships, and because of all the trade, and also because of all the desalination plants and all that. It's very vulnerable situation. These are all glass palaces. These are all glass mansions. But again, I can't rule anything out. And if the United States strikes, then I think if it's serious, then I think the we will see people flee the Persian Gulf region before it happens. The rats will jump ship because they know that will be the end of these tiny regimes. So people will leave immediately. And I think the family members of the dictatorships, which have all their money or a lot of money in the West, they will be among the first to go. So what the Iranians are doing is that they're speaking with their friends in Moscow and Beijing and discussing the upcoming indirect negotiations with the United States so that it would be impossible for the Americans to drive a wedge between Iran's relationships, whether with Russia or China. And from my communications in Russia and China, when I travel, or when they invite me, or when colleagues come to Iran and we speak, they have the same sort of issue, and that is that the West and its affiliates, they try to create an environment of concern in Russia or in China that Iran is about to do a deal with the West and it's going to sacrifice the Chinese relationship or it's going to sacrifice the Iranian relationship. And the same is true with Russia. All three countries are facing the same sort of problem and the same sort of psychological warfare. One key objective is to make sure that the United States or its partners, if there are any left, although I'm pretty sure that the Europeans will continue to be poodles when it comes to Iran. The objective is to prevent the United States from creating an environment where they can divide and rule. Because you always see how, for example, in Iran, the Persian language media that beams in from the West, that's funded by Western government agencies or Western agencies linked to Western governments, they're constantly saying that the Russians are betraying the Iranians, the Chinese are about to betray the Iranians. We've always been hearing this throughout the years, especially during sensitive moments and junctures. So, what Trump is going to have is nothing different than what Biden had. For example, first of all, during the Biden years, we've had indirect negotiations with the United States extensively and repeatedly. And during the nuclear negotiations in Vienna, where we almost had a deal, but the Americans balked, they backed off, they backed down, they walked away. During those months of negotiations, they were constantly having indirect negotiations on a daily basis for many weeks. Dr. Balgani was in charge of the nuclear file. Just like today, Dr. Arokchi is in charge of the nuclear file. So that's not new. And even opponents of Trump in the United States, when it comes to Iran, the regime, the political establishment, is extremely hostile. So they will try to frame the story, any story, in a way in which is not good for Iran. So we are already seeing claims being made that the Iranians have given concessions, whereas Iran has given no concessions. And over the past few weeks, Iran has been carrying out military maneuvers, which is sending a message to the United States. And also, the leader has said very openly that we're not going to directly negotiate. And after Trump, hours ago, said that we have direct negotiations with Iran, and Iran is very terrible at soft power, and they're awful, they're horrible. But the foreign minister, Dr. Adalci, very swiftly wrote a tweet saying that the negotiations will be indirect. And he also said in an interview that I just saw before coming here before we started the program, he said that we have no plans for direct negotiations because a a New York Times journalist said that three Iranian sources, and whenever a Western media outlet, Reuters or whoever, speaks of these unnamed people, it's almost always a fabrication. He said very clearly, the foreign minister, that Iran has no plans for direct negotiations with the United States at all at this stage. And of course, the conditions for direct negotiations have already been stated by the leader and Khamenei, and the United States will have to rethink its policy towards Iran. So, whenever your viewers hear informed sources or an unnamed official, or an official who wants to remain anonymous, that means it's just bogus. They may have spoken to some, I don't know, retired diplomat or some low ranking government official somewhere, but that's never trust the Western media on these things. The second is the place where the negotiations are being held. The message that the Americans sent to Iran was not through Oman. And the Americans wanted the indirect negotiations to be held elsewhere. Iran sent its reply through Oman and said that these indirect negotiations will be conducted in Oman. So the Americans didn't get anything there either. Now, the difference between direct and indirect negotiations is that, let me put it this way. The very fact that the Americans want direct negotiations so much is itself a reason why the Iranians don't want to have direct negotiations. When it's something that the Americans want for whatever reason, that means that the Iranians use that to their advantage, the fact that they're not going to negotiate directly. If the Americans want to say anything, if they want to convey anything, if they're willing to compromise, if they put a reasonable proposal on the table with regards to any issue, a ceasefire in Gaza, that's fine. Hamas has negotiated, although the Americans have violated their own ceasefire agreement. But the indirect negotiations for Iran gives Iran a strong political advantage, but also the fact that they do not negotiate directly makes it clear to everyone that it is the Americans who seek something and who are not getting it. Now, some people who say, why should Iran have indirect negotiations? And my response would be that it's clear. If you want to carry global public opinion, you have to be seen as the side that is not the problem. The world sees Trump as a big problem. It's now universal, literally. Now, especially with the trade war. Europe has problems with Trump. Russia has huge problems. They're waging war against Russia. China, of course, as we now see. Everyone has problems with the United States. So why not present yourself in a place where you are willing to negotiate on your terms, indirect, in Oman, and so on, as I've already explained? If the Americans change their position, begin to behave rationally somehow, fine. If they don't, you have told the world that you are not stubborn and that you are willing to speak, again, indirectly. Iran has a much stronger hand today than it did back then. Iran's nuclear program is much more developed, thanks to Trump. Thanks to Trump. Because of Trump, Iran halted its commitments to the nuclear deal. Again, Iran is fully committed to the NPT, and it abides by the legal framework that exists within the International Atomic Energy Agency. But the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, limited Iran's nuclear industry. So since Trump tore up the deal, Iran developed its nuclear industry. And so now Iran is one of the most advanced countries in the world when it comes to nuclear energy. It is probably in the top 10. And this is something that Trump will have to accept. You can't just say you have to give it up. That's never going to happen. We're not going to go back to 2015 anymore because this is not the same nuclear program as Dr. Arokci rightly pointed out. So Iran's military is different today, and the United States is in a much tougher situation because of the global challenges with Russia and China, the major problems that they face at home. So there is always a potential for a deal. There's always a potential there's nothing can be ruled out. But at the moment, because of the attitude of the United States, the Iranians have no interest in negotiating. If the United States changes its attitude and shows that it can be trusted at some point down the road, the Americans are going to have to take all of these into consideration. And I think based on American and Western claims, we've seen that impact in Russia. We've seen, according to the Americans, that Iran drone capabilities, they're having a daily effect. The second is that Iran's missile and drone capabilities are infinitely different from in the past. Iran's military capabilities are far greater than what they were. Iran has chosen a very smart route to make a strong, inexpensive, relatively speaking, high-tech military industry, which can defend the country. Trump was the person who weakened his own hand, partially at least, when it comes to the nuclear program itself. When countries in the region refuse to sanction the Israeli regime, when they refuse to break off ties with the regime, when Erdogan is refusing to end trade and business with the regime, where he refuses to stop flights to Ben Gurion Airport, how can we expect China and Russia to make big steps in the right direction? If these regimes did take steps, then that would create an environment where other countries would do the same. But so far, none have done it. None of them have made a move. Especially for China, Iran is a bit different. For example, the Emirates, their number one trading partner is China, but then they go on to tell the Americans that we're going to do all of our investments in the United States. And that, of course, is not something that pleases the Chinese. So for China, Iran is very important because Iran is independent. They can trust Iran. Iran is not going to obey the United States when it pushes policies that are anti-Chinese. But the countries on the other side of the Persian Gulf will abide by American demands, more or less. But that aside, China and Russia obviously have a lot of influence, and they have a lot of ways. China needs stability in the Persian Gulf region, and just like everyone else. And China does not have an interest in war. And unlike during the previous Trump regime, China's trade with Iran is much stronger now. Russia's relationship with Iran is very different from back then. Russia back then was much weaker than it was now. It's the United States has been declining, the West has been declining, Russia and China and the global South have been rising. The situation is different today than in the past. So China wants a stable Persian Gulf region. China also has an interest in having independent actors in the Persian Gulf region be strong. So China and Russia do have a role to play. Again, this is all speculation. At the moment, China continues to buy Iranian oil, and it has refused to abide by U.S. demands. Things have changed since 8 years ago. China is stronger today. China recognizes that listening to the United States only makes it worse, and the United States comes back with new demands every time they back down. China is more independent of the United States now. They do less trade because of the U.S. sanctions and tariffs. So China has diversified its trade with other countries. So it's less vulnerable. Iran has a strong hand for the reasons that I've mentioned, and adding these two also. But it's going to be a very complicated situation in our region. But the root issue is the ethnic cleansing, the slaughter of the Palestinian people, which the United States supports and the West collectively supports, even though they're divided over Russia. They all support the slaughter of women and children in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in the West Bank. And as the more this continues, I think the more dangerous the region becomes for the West. And I'm not talking about Iran, I'm talking about instability, broader instability. So Iran has large capabilities, and over the past few months, it has been building on those capabilities very swiftly. There's been a sharp increase in military budget, especially for advanced systems. I have no doubt that the Americans will be defeated. It will be a catastrophe for the world, and Iran definitely does not seek war, but the Americans would lose. And that would be the end of the US empire. And personally, I think it would probably be the end of the United States as we know it, because with all the internal divisions, such a catastrophe following up on the other catastrophes that we're already seeing playing out for the United States, I'm not quite sure that the United States would remain a stable and united country afterwards. So one could say the Americans could bomb these bases. First of all, there are many bases. Second of all, we know from American sources that the bombing in Yemen has failed. They have not been able to destroy Yemen's underground bases for striking ships in the Red Sea. So if the United States is failing in Yemen with bunker busters and B-2 and B-52s, then how is it going to succeed with Iran, which is much larger, has many more bases and infinitely more drones and missiles and more advanced drones and missiles? The assets in the Persian Gulf region are far more sensitive than the very sensitive Red Sea. But what we have in the Persian Gulf is infinitely more important, because if there's no more oil from the Arabian Peninsula, then the global economy will collapse. The US economy will collapse. And things aren't looking very pretty as it is anyway, with the tariff war going on. So Iran's missile defenses and drone defenses are spread out across the country, and they're all prepared. They already know what their targets are across the region. There are tens of thousands of American soldiers across the region, and they're huge, they're enormous American assets, and those who are complicit would also be targets. The Americans have to prove that they've changed. The Iranians are confident about their position. Iran is within the framework of international law. It has the right to have a peaceful nuclear program. Everything that it does is within the framework of international law. And if the United States strikes Iran, and Iran will definitely move and make a nuclear weapon, but it will leave the NPT. It will do it legally. In other words, has the right to leave the NPT, and it will leave the NPT, and then it will make a nuclear weapon. It's quite ironic that it is really Trump that has pushed Iran closer to a nuclear weapon. And if Trump attacks Iran, Iran has said, Dr. Larijani, the leader's advisor, has said Iran will develop a nuclear weapon. And if the United States strikes Iran, it cannot stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, which I think is a significant statement in itself. It shows that Iran has the capacity, with or without a US strike, to develop nuclear weapons. But Iran doesn't want to do that. But Trump has been pushing Iran in that direction all these years. The JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015, which I'm no fan of, I think it had many flaws. That deal limited Iran's peaceful nuclear program. And when Trump tore up the deal, Iran waited for a year. It continued to abide by all of its obligations. Then, and during the second year, it gradually cut it decreased its commitments to its obligations. In other words, it began to decrease its commitment to the deal. And after 2 years, Iran began to move fast forward in developing its peaceful nuclear program. And we are where we are now. So it's as a result of Trump's policies that Iran is where it is today, with a much more extensive and advanced nuclear program. So that's one point, meaning that Trump has pushed Iran in this direction. The second point is Iran's conventional capabilities. Iran has been preparing itself for a war with the United States for more than 2 decades. All of these underground missile bases, underground drone bases, and the drone bases, I think, are much more dangerous for the United States because US assets in the region, some are very close to Iran. The whole of the Persian Gulf is a series of glass palaces, and the Iranians can demolish everything. In fact, if anyone seriously thinks that the Americans are going to attack Iran, then they should leave Qatar, Bahrain, the Emirates, Kuwait, and so on immediately. All of these Arab dictatorships will not last if there is war. And by the time, if war starts, it will be too late to escape. And there are reasons why Iran doesn't want to do it. Iran sees it as an inhumane weapon, in line with the fatwa that Imam Khomeini gave during the Iran-Iraq war not to make chemical weapons. When Saddam was using chemical weapons that came from the West, Iran did not do so because Imam Khomeini said it's an inhumane weapon. Interestingly, the West also banned Iran from purchasing gas masks, but just shows how inhumane they are. But in addition to that, the Iranians feel that having nuclear weapons only creates an incentive for countries across the region, not just the Arabian Peninsula, but the Caucasus, Central Asia, and small countries, dictatorships, unstable countries. It encourages them to seek nuclear weapons. So Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. Being a threshold state for Iran is enough. It's quite clear that what Mr. Pezeshkian said is rational. And what I was saying in response to the previous question, and that is that if the United States changes its policy towards Iran, then negotiations can move forward. If it doesn't, then there will be no success. And we've had experiences with the United States before, and that's why we're skeptical. And the main reason why we are not going to have direct negotiations is because of our skepticism towards the United States. But Trump, during the previous campaign, when he first became president, he said some similar things too. And even during his presidency, I remember during the U.S. Super Bowl, between the two halves, he did an interview with Fox News, and the presenter said, I think he spoke of Russia and Russia doing horrible things and killing people, and then he said, we've done terrible things too. And a lot of people were shocked. Or in his debates, he spoke out against the war, the Iraq war. So some people were hoping that he would be different, but during his presidency, he continued all the wars. He didn't stop any of the wars. The occupation in Syria continued. The occupation in Afghanistan continued. The genocidal attacks on Yemen continued. And the United States continued, and the provocations against Russia and Ukraine continued. So he didn't do anything different from previous presidents because many of them were very smart people and people who I respect. And they were hoping that Trump would change things. But I think there really never was any room for optimism. If I was an American, I would probably not have voted. If I had to, I'd probably Stein, even though her position on Syria was horrible. And I think Tulsi Gabbard's admissions in the Senate confirmation hearing about this whole some U.S. plot where you know criminals like anyway regional criminals helped carry out for the United States. I think her position was really unacceptable on Syria. So in a sense, he's what Trump has done is he's succeeded in both terms. This term so far, he's succeeded in isolating the United States globally. And that is something that the global South should use to weaken the empire. What he did different, I think, actually makes him, and this is I should be very careful about how to frame this, makes him, I think, worse, a president that will turn out to be worse for the United States than other presidents because he has destroyed U.S. soft power because he's incapable of the hypocrisy and that we see among other presidents. He is brutal, but he's open about it, and he's not very sophisticated. For example, I'm not saying he's dumb, by the way, but I don't see him as a careful thinker, someone who surrounds himself with competent people. He's not like that. Even sinister, but competent people. As I said before on your show, the United States Trump does not have any new cards up his sleeve that Biden didn't have. He can be more outrageous in his language and more crude in his barbarism and humanity, but he doesn't have any special weapon that didn't exist 4 months ago. But with regards to Yemen, I think that it's the arrogance of power. It's something that all of these empires do. They don't learn even when they see failure, it's their arrogance. They think that we can do it. We're exceptional. We're different. We see further than others, and we are somehow. They're just like Zionism. The Zionists, they're a chosen people. For these elites in the United States, that mentality is there. They see themselves as exceptional. And they believe that they have powers that will somehow lead them to victory. In Yemen, Israel, I think this is the last stage. We're in the final phase of the regime's existence. It will not last very long. It may take a few years, but it has been destroyed in the eyes of the world. People despise it. But he needed to continue the war because of the internal problems that he had and has. That's why he expanded the war to Lebanon. That's why he attacked Iran. That's why he's constant, and that's why he's pushing hard in the West Bank. More people. He's pushing on all fronts because that's the best way to keep Israel itself from exploding from within. The divide among Israelis is huge. The liberals and the Ashkenazi Jews are in one camp. And by the way, it's not as if one camp is better than the other. Both sides of this side support the genocide. Both sides support ethnic cleansing. It's not as if one side supports human rights and freedom and no, it's an internal thing. Believe that the Israel should be run in one way, the other group believes in a different way, but they hate each other. The divide is huge. And that is why Netanyahu has continued with all of these policies. Otherwise, the smartest thing that he could have done would be to end this whole genocide after a month or two, let's say October the 7th to November the 7th or December the 7th. And then people would still have believed their lies about beheadings and their lies about rapes. But then they just went on, and the images, people across the world were watching, and then people started getting more curious about the history of Palestine. They learned about the Nakba. Then they started looking into the claims that the Israeli regime was making, and they found out that the beheadings were all lies promoted by Western journalists to help with the genocide. The rape allegations were all lies to help the Israelis, Palestinians. And not only did it demolish the Israeli regime, but it demolished Western media, it demolished Western elites, it made the West It discredited the West altogether, and it discredited journalists, mainstream media journalists in the West altogether. So the damage that was done to the regime was, I think, you can't even calculate it.